We all like to complain that the world's governments will never do enough to tackle climate change, but whenever there's an election, we never vote in a government that will actually do something about it. People realise how serious things are. For example, one opinion poll found that in Britain, over 80% of people are concerned about climate change and think it's a climate crisis. In France and Germany, it's in the 70%. Even in the United States, 66% of people think we're in the middle of a climate crisis. Why don't we vote for a government that will actually do something about it? Because we're afraid of where we're heading to with climate change, and also afraid of, if governments were to act, how it might affect us. Would we still be able to fly or drive the same sorts of cars that we have? Would we lose our jobs, our life savings, everything that we've worked for? The problem is, we're all in denial. So in this video, we're going to look at what denial is from a psychological point of view, how journalists and news agencies are trying to do something about it, and we're going to see how radical the United Nations is when it comes to changing public opinion. On the good side, we get to find out why your friends and family don't want to talk to you about climate change and why they think you're rude for even bringing it up. We're going to be positive, okay? That's the watchword for this video, positive. Have a look at this headline. Alarming new IPCC report released, and you've already stopped reading this headline. Do you know what the problem is? Well, the European Broadcasting Union, which is an association that includes all public service broadcasters in Europe and some broadcasters around the world, has been looking into the problem. This is a report they've produced, and this is what they think the problem is. But what should we do when audiences are voting with their feet against a diet of climate catastrophe journalism? It's overwhelming, it's depressing, and there are many alternative ways to spend their time. It's time to try something different. And what is the problem? What I found most striking was the extent of denial when you confront yourself or others with the severity of the climate crisis. I had a somewhat judgmental view of denial, including my own. I saw it as a weakness or something that needed to be attacked. I suspect this is the reason why so much journalism is so alarming, confrontational and full of doom. Journalists often feel they have to hammer it home. Then I started reading up on the psychology of denial. Today I think it would be better to look at denial with more compassion. It's an integral part of our psyche. In fact, it helps us survive. Denial has many layers and is something that can rarely ever be transformed with shock and awe journalism. We all know about climate change deniers and the professional online trolls, possibly paid for by the big oil companies, but there's also something called soft denial. It neglects its urgency. It underestimates the extent of social change needed. It prefers inaction and maintaining the status quo. It fails to act as though there is a climate emergency. Does that remind you of anyone? It's your friends and family, it's you and me. This is what Wikipedia has to say about soft climate denial. Soft climate change denial is a state of mind acknowledging the existence of global warming while remaining in partial psychological or intellectual denialism about its reality or impact. They behave as though the existence or severity of global warming are not fully real. Sometimes you hear people refer to it as cognitive dissonance. You believe one thing, you believe there is a climate change and it's really serious, but at the same time you just carry on living your life as you did before, because it's just easy, it's just socially acceptable, isn't it? It's a social norm. To understand the problem, we have to understand what denial is. It's a defense mechanism that aims to ignore negative, unpleasant thoughts or feelings. During a time of change or uncertainty, it's quite normal to be worried, and it's a natural way to respond to that worry by being in denial. It's an involuntary thing, but it does help us to sort of resolve our conflicting thoughts. That we're in the middle of a climate emergency, but we still have to sort of live our lives in the way we did before. So by being in denial, it sort of gives you time just to work it all out. The problem is, if you're in denial, it makes you very resistant to change. And the way you resist is by rationalising your situation. It doesn't matter if you're a heroin addict or on the board of a big oil company, you can rationalise that while it's not ideal to be a heroin addict, in your case, it's quite okay to carry on as you are. The problem is, you're so resistant to change, if someone points out to you how badly you're acting or tries to get you to change, it makes you very angry. When people feel their choices are restricted or that others are telling them what to do, they sometimes rebel and do the opposite. Scientists have a term for this: psychological reactance. When reactance is happening in our minds and bodies, we have negative thoughts and we often feel anger, hostility and aggression. If you want to get someone who's in denial, who's suffering psychological reactance to change, you don't tell them what to do, you win them over using empathy. Empathy is the ability to recognise, understand and share the thoughts and feelings of another person. To show empathy, you have to understand that person's situation, you have to understand the life that they lead, you have to understand their concerns, you have to understand them. And people are afraid, they need reassuring with a positive solution, something they can look forward to and would want to do and don't have to be told they're going to lose things. Reframing the experience so it is no longer a threat to freedom is one way we can try to avoid psychological reactance. Empathy is all about winning people over through respect and kindness. It's not about winning an argument using scientific data about how serious climate change is, although you might want to do that. The problem is, at a time when we need lots of empathy, we need social cohesion, because all societies suffering stress, whether it's climate change or another problem, we all need good high levels of social cohesion so that we keep society together and we can all act as a team and sort out the problem. At a time when we need lots of empathy and social cohesion, the research suggests that societies are becoming more divided and there's less empathy. I can't help noticing there are certain people, possibly the big oil companies, who have realised we need empathy and social cohesion, and maybe they're promoting divisiveness, especially if you look at some of the news channels and the climate change deniers. You have to wonder if there are people who can make a lot of money out of having a divided society. The people who have the job of trying to explain to the public climate change and trying to provide a positive solution are the journalists and the news agencies. There is a lot of anxiety around climate change, and we know this can cause news avoidance. This is why it is so important to demonstrate that there are solutions and they do exist. Technologies are evolving fast and transition to renewables is possible. Well, certainly it's possible to transition to renewables. There are technologies. As we've seen in previous videos, it's far from clear whether those technologies are going to be enough. But for this video, we're being positive, okay? We're having a positive solution video. Almost every editor featured in this report tells us that journalism that works for their audiences focuses on solutions, not just problems. If you find yourself reading the news or seeing something online and you think, this doesn't reflect the seriousness of climate change, and you're pulling your hair out of frustration, they're not interested in you. You're already on board. You want to change. You realise how serious things are. The audience they're going for are the people who maybe don't realise these things, possibly because they don't want to know and been deliberately avoiding it. The Count Everything channel in this way has it quite easy, because I realise I'm just preaching to the converted and I get some nice comments back and some likes. But I realise I'm not going to change the world. If you're a public service broadcaster like the BBC, it's your job to communicate to everyone, including some of the most resistant people. Here's one person with a reputation from being far from scientific when it comes to climate change. It's Nigel Farage. He's sort of Britain's version of Donald Trump, although Nigel Farage isn't quite so evil as that. And he has a news programme on what's called GB News. It's a bit like Fox News in America, but it's not quite that bad, because we do have some regulations about online broadcasting. And here he is, he's interviewing a climate scientist, and to be fair to Nigel, the climate scientist he's interviewing is a proper scientist, and he does give the scientist a chance to explain what climate change is. So although he might be a bit sceptical himself, he is trying to play it fair. Now, have a look at some of the comments that were posted on YouTube against this news article. The IPCC is a neutral referee in the same way that Stalin was a humanitarian. Global issues should be addressed globally. What is the point of scaring poor Brits when they have already done more than most other countries? As you saw in the last video, Britain is no longer in a position of leadership, but the government says we are, the BBC blindly reports it, and so people in Britain think we are doing a good job. So disinformation. And then another comment said, in the 70s, 80s and early 90s, we were going to freeze to death. Now we are going to drown or burn to death. It's those sorts of people the media have to try and win over. So you have to understand, if they're a bit gentle with them and a bit persuasive, and they're offering positive solutions. And the number one concern people seem to have is, how will it affect their jobs? Because that affects their lifestyle and everything. Combating climate change means a transformation in the way we live. We see technical solutions. The price point for renewables has dropped significantly. This has been an incredible success story. There is no alternative to a just and green energy transition. We have no choice about a green transition. We just have to get on with it, and we can, because it's going to generate lots of jobs. In the United States, it's thought the transition will generate more jobs than will be lost from the fossil fuel industries. The United States government's budget lowers energy costs, combats climate change, has environmental justice at its heart. The opposition party in Britain, the Labour Party, are promising a jobs bonus when they get into power and speed up the green transition. In France and Germany, it's all about jobs. And remember, it's all going to be achieved by understanding your audience and addressing your audience individually, which is quite possible to do, because with social media, like you've got TikTok and Facebook and Twitter and online news channels, different online newspapers, you can address each audience group to their own concerns. And when you address them with empathy, because you understand them, you offer them a positive solution. And here is the BBC's training guide for its journalists when it comes to reporting climate change. Annoyingly, I can't go inside each module, but I have managed to find the front page. But how is the training broken down? Number one, what is climate change? Good question to ask. Number two, what are the responses to climate change? Number three, producing climate change stories for multi-platform for different types of audience. Number four, a solution journalism approach. So you're providing solutions for your audience, so they have a positive experience of climate change and are no longer afraid of it. And number five, audience responsive journalism. So you know your audience, the lives they lead, how climate change might affect them, how attempts to mitigate for climate change might affect them, and you can put together a story that they're interested in and they're not afraid with, because you're including solutions as well. Now you might be thinking, we have known about climate change for at least 35 years, since Professor James Hansen presented to United States Senate Committee in 1988, I think. Why is it now the BBC is only getting around to doing this sort of thing? Why are other journalists only thinking about it now? Number one, because they weren't really interested in climate change. They didn't take it seriously enough. Number two, when they did, they just lectured the audience. But we know now you have to show empathy and be positive. But once you've got a positive solution to climate change, and you win the people over and get their interest, because this is now a new and exciting prospect they want to know all about, that's just the beginning. Then you have to move what's called the Overton window. You have to explain to them not only what the positive solutions are, but why we have to change, and change so quickly. And the Overton window is described as the general background and the general understanding that everyone has, that is the background for all political discussion. So for example, at the moment, Britain's net zero targets are to try and be net zero by 2050. As you saw in the previous video, the United Nations wants countries in the global north to be net zero by 2040. And Professor Anderson thinks if we want to have any chance of keeping below a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, the countries in the global north need to be carbon neutral by 2030. But at the moment, the discussion we seem to see in the news about the 2050 climate target is it too ambitious? Should instead we have a later date? Even if a journalist who was interviewing a politician, or the BBC made a news programme about how we have to be carbon neutral by 2030, it just wouldn't have any effect. Everyone would think, well, this is completely mad. The politician certainly wouldn't be expecting a question like that. I wouldn't know how to answer it. And if they did, the public wouldn't really think it was practical and have any interest in it. So you have to move the Overton window so people understand the issues and then you can have a constructive political debate, and then you can act finally after 35 years of knowing that we have climate change. And then we finally get to find out why your friends and family don't want to talk to you about climate change. It's called social norms. A social norm is the thing that describes behaviour that is customary, appropriate and socially acceptable. And it's an important thing for the United Nations, because so far, if we got to win people over with positive stories, there are lots of people who have very high carbon lifestyles. You know, they fly a lot, have big cars. There are lots of businesses like the big oil companies that are really dependent on oil. To tell them a positive story, to give them a positive future, you're going to have to quite possibly pay them a lot of money in subsidies to get them to transition. The theory the United Nations has with social norms is, if you can get quite a small group of your population to change, certainly it's a minority, everyone will follow. So you don't have to win a scientific argument, you just get a significant minority to change. And because we're humans, we're social animals, we'd like to do what everyone else is doing. If someone else is doing something new and exciting, we want to do it as well. Changes in social norms often start with pilot experiments led by dedicated individuals and niche groups. Individuals' agency is central as social change agents and narrators of meaning. Individuals' agency, this is all about people being free to do whatever they want to do. They understand the situation and so they act willingly, and it's a great fulfilling thing, isn't it? Very satisfying. I'm very concerned about climate change, but I'm doing something good about it. It's not, as we saw in the beginning, if you tell someone to do, they get angry. So individuals' agency is an important part of this positive new solution. These bottom-up social cultural forces catalyse a supportive policy environment which enables changes. So again, the United Nations is not expecting central governments to do this. It wants ordinary people to start to act and to change social norms and to win over the rest of the population. I can't help noticing how often the United Nations has given up on central governments. Social influencers and thought leaders can increase the adoption of low carbon technologies, behaviours and lifestyles. Between 10% and 30% of committed individuals are required to set new social norms. You only have to get a small minority to change and everyone else will follow in this theory. Remember, we're being positive for this video. But the UN's vision is much more radical than people realise, but it won't tell them that until we've won them over with positive solutions. Here's what the United Nations really thinks we need to do. Broader contextual factors and cultural trends towards consumerism, individualisation and defining self-worth through conspicuous consumption can drive emissions up. If you have a very high carbon lifestyle, it's inevitable your lifestyle is going to change. Don't tell the public that yet. Their lives will be different, but hopefully they won't be any worse. Economic growth measured by total or individual income growth is the main driver of greenhouse gas emissions. This is why the UN isn't relying on national governments, because national governments love increases in income and the tax they can get from it. There is a growing realisation that mere monetary value of income growth is insufficient to measure national welfare and individual well-being. If you're thinking to yourself, well, this sounds like some sort of socialist plot, I think it is, but it's what we need to have a survivable future. It is very radical, isn't it? And in fact, the United Nations and its suggestions are much more in line with groups like Extinction Rebellion and other environmental groups. But that's only because we haven't moved the Overton window. If we can have a positive story, move the Overton window, change social norms, then these sorts of suggestions will stop being radical and will become acceptable. And then we can change. Well, that's pretty much the whole of the story. I've been trying to be positive for this video, and I believe the individual academic research, the professional reports produced by the European Broadcasting Union, the reports by the United Nations, but all together it does seem very ambitious, doesn't it? If you think we've got to halve CO2 emissions by 2030, and where are we now? The middle of 2023, so we've got 6.5 years. You've got to change the whole of society with your positive stories and your audience targeted approach. It does seem very difficult, but we're being positive. However, this does put the count everything channel in a difficult position, because the Counter Everything channel believes in trying to tell the truth based on simple science by climate scientists or the UN or the reading articles from The Guardian. This is suggesting I should try and be less factual and more positive. You have to be careful not to reproduce greenwash, that's an important part of the approach. I might do one positive video in the future, but you know, my audience is already converted, so maybe I'm not doing too much damage. Can you see how easy it is to rationalise things? You know, you might think you're doing the wrong thing, but you could say, well, it's okay for my channel to do it this way. That's the end of the video really, but I have got one more thing I want to say. The Counter Everything channel prides itself in its worthy but dull videos. But I had a comment for the last video from someone who makes climate change videos in Japan. It's an English person, I think they're an English teacher in Japan. They make videos explaining climate change by reading articles from The Guardian in English and then translating them to Japanese. And if you think this sounds a bit odd, you wait until you see the videos. They're not dull or worthy. In fact, the presenter's quite a cool person and the videos are quite funky. So if you want to show some love to a fellow live streamer who's doing climate videos, and you might be thinking, why would I want to watch those? They're all in Japanese. They're not in Japanese. Half of it is in English, half of it's in Japanese, but all of it is just astonishing. So I'll put a link in the video description if you want to go and watch that. Otherwise, feel free to leave a comment or to share it with your friends. And thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.